Hi there, and welcome to the lecture on social psychology. Let's begin. Social psychology is a unique division of psychology. It's a field of study that tries to uncover the influence of social experiences. And you see on the slide, by social experiences, I'm saying social experiences that actually occur or social experiences that are imagined. In other words, maybe our perceptions of social experiences and how these things influence our thoughts, influence our emotions, and influence our behaviors or our actions. So here is a list of areas of interest that are studied among social psychologists, and we'll talk about a few of these in this lecture. So when we're talking about attitudes, attributions, biases, conformity, you see all this stuff. This is the area of known as social psychology. This is the stuff that social psychologists get into. So let's talk about some of these things, starting with social influence. So we're talking about the social context or the influence of a situational context that has some impact on our thoughts or our actions and sometimes our emotions. Social influence, whether it's actual or perceived, could have a major impact on our behaviors and our thoughts and our feelings. So the first aspect of social influence I'm going to talk about is conformity. Well, what does it mean to conform? Is conformity a good thing or a bad thing? Well, like everything else in this course, it all depends. But conformity is pretty much human. It's human nature to conform toward a group's norm. It could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. But the question here is, why do people conform to group norms? And one of the first experiments done on this occurred in the late 30s by Sharif's famous autokinetic experiment. Now, you might have to Google this and or actually read your book chapter to get more specific information. It's kind of hard for me to verbally describe an autokinetic experiment, but I'm going to do the best I can. Basically, if you get involved in this experiment, you're going to be in this room and it's very dark. But somewhere in the distance of this dark room, you see a white dot, a dot of light being projected. All right, so that's pretty easy to understand. You're in a dark room, you see this white dot, and then you're looking at it and you're told to keep your eye on the dot. And at some point, the experimenter will ask you, did you see the dot move? And that's the thing about this autokinetic experiment, that it sets the stage to have this visual illusion that the dot moves, when in fact it doesn't. This is sort of a characteristic of our visual field. Our eyes kind of plays a trick on us, and we get the illusion that the dot is moving when in fact it doesn't move at all. So knowing this, Sharif had folks in this room, and he asked them, did the dot move? If so, by how much? And let's just say hypothetically, most people said, okay, it moved by 3 inches. So in the individual condition, the report is, yeah, the dot moved by about 3 inches, but participants don't really know how much it actually moved. But then he put some participants in a group condition. And this is key for understanding this autokinetic experiment. That some folks were in the individual condition, in other words, they saw the dot by themselves, while others were in a group condition. And the interesting thing about the group condition, let's say you were in this experiment and you were in the group condition. You would be in a room with, say, 3 other people, and you kind of believe that these 3 other people were like you. They were just participants in the experiment. But that's not the case. Those 3 other people were not subjects in the experiment. They were actually confederates. They were in on this experiment. They worked with the investigator. So when all 4 of you are in this room and you see the dot, everybody is asked, how much does the dot move? The first 3 confederates all say 6 inches. And when it's your turn, you probably said 6 inches as well. That's basically what Sharif found, that when the individual is in a group context, that individual conforms to the answers from that norm. Now, why is that? Well, I'll get to that in a moment. But I first want to say that this experiment was replicated. Now, just to be clear, when you're by yourself, you come up with an answer. But when you're in a group, you conform to the group's answer. And this was replicated by Royer. He and his colleagues basically got folks in the group condition doing the same thing. And, if the norm was 6 inches and it was your turn to report, you would probably conform and say 6 inches. But Royer and his colleagues put you back in the individual condition. And guess what? Your answer was 6 inches. So even though you don't have that immediacy of the group norm to inform you, your previous experience of being with that group norm influenced what you did on the individual level. So if you've been following what I've been saying carefully, maybe you have to rewind and hear this again. We're talking about conformity. Why do individuals conform to a group norm? In these two experiments, there was some ambiguity going on. In other words, that social influence of that group norm kind of fulfills the need of getting correct information. Correct information when you are in an uncertain situation. And with the autokinetic experiments, when you're in the room, you don't really know how much that dot seems to be moving, even though it's not moving. It's a visual illusion. So there's a human tendency, when you really don't know what the correct information is, to go to the group norm for some kind of direction. And these experiments demonstrate a reason for why we adhere to a group norm. Maybe we adhere to group norms when we're trying to get correct information, when we don't know what the correct answer is. And in this case, we're talking about conformity as being a form of informational social influence. So social influence definitely has an impact on our ability to conform when it serves the purpose of getting information. So the conclusion is, why do people conform? Well, maybe they conform to group norms in pursuit of getting accurate information. That's one explanation for why folks conform to group norms. Now, Solomon Asch came up with a set of investigations demonstrating another reason why social influence has some impact on our ability to conform. And his experiments were referred to as normative social influence. So we're looking at the effects of social influence, not in an informational capacity, but what he calls a normative capacity. And Asch did this by subjecting research participants to a line length comparison chart. And he had confederates with him. In other words, he had people who are actually part of the study acting as if they were research participants. So if you go back to what Sharif and Royer did, he had individuals in this room with other people looking at something. What they were looking at was a dot, and it wasn't very sure if it was moving and if it was moving by how much. So there was some ambiguity or uncertainty in that context. But what Asch did is he put them in a similar situation where there was no uncertainty. It was very clear what was going on. So take a look at this slide. If you were involved in Asch's study, you would be in a room with other people, and the whole group would be asked, okay, you see the target line on the left. Which of the lines to the right, either A, B, or C, most closely resembles the target line? All right, so that's the direction folks in the group were given. Well, you're in this group with like 3 other people, and the first 3 people would say B. Now that's odd, because clearly B is not the correct answer, right? B is much taller than the target line. So the first person says B, the second person says B, the third person says B. And there's a chance you would say, probably B. That is what he found. In other words, when the Confederates responded with the wrong answer, the answer wasn't B, the answer was C. But everybody says B. Solomon Asch and his colleagues found that most participants, 75% of the time, conformed to the wrong answer. So about 3/4 of the folks at some point during these line length comparisons would go with the norm. They would say the wrong answer. And when given repeated exposure to this experiment, over 1/3, 37% of folks went with the wrong answer because everybody said B, 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 and they themselves went with the norm. That's crazy. Why would somebody go with the norm? It's not to get information. It's obviously very clear. If you go back to the last slide, the obvious answer was C, or whatever the correct answer was. So even though the information is clear as day in front of you, why would you go with the group norm? There has to be another explanation. And that's exactly what Asch and his colleagues discovered. That maybe in some circumstances, our behavior is influenced by the desire for social approval. We want people to like us. In other words, we're going to go with the group norm, kind of knowing that the answer is wrong. And the reason for that is that we want approval from that norm. And this type of conformity is known as normative social influence. We're being affected by social influence because we want to be normal. We want to not stick out from the herd. So if you think about it, there are two explanations for conformity that have been validated through experimental research. In some instances, we conform to the group norm when we're trying to get information, and that's what Sharif found. Or there's normative social influence of conformity. We conform to the norm because we want people to like us. Interesting, but that's what psychology is all about. Now let's talk about another concept in social psychology known as compliance. By compliance, we're talking about acting in accordance with a direct request. If somebody asks you to do something, you either comply or you don't comply with that request. Well, why is it we comply with requests? Well, there's a number of things to look at, and it has to do with how does somebody approach you for that request. And there are several techniques I'm going to go over now to explain why we may or may not respond to a request. If somebody approaches us with what is known as a foot in the door technique, they're going to approach us in a manner where they're going to try to get us to comply by making a very small request and then following it up with a larger request. For example, if we're in the classroom, I might come up to you at your desk and say, hey, excuse me, may I have a sheet of paper? And you're like, okay, sure, here's a sheet of paper. I'm like, great, thanks. Hey, can I borrow your pen for a second? And then you comply with that request. And then I say, hey, can I see your cell phone for just a second? I'll give it right back. And then you give me that cell phone for just a second, even though you're kind of like unsure what I'm up to. Well, that's an example of foot in the door. I got you to comply with a very simple request, the sheet of paper, follow that up with, a pen, and now I'm making a larger demand. Why would a student comply with that? Well, social psychologists believe that sometimes we comply with these requests because we have this need for being perceived as a consistent person. I mean, it's human nature to be held in high regard or wanting to be held in high regard by others. Part of that might be our need for others to see us as people of integrity, that we are consistent with our actions. So if I am going to comply with a simple request, I might have this need within me to comply with a larger request because I want you to view me as a consistent person, somebody who has this sense of integrity. And people who get you to comply probably know this about you, and maybe that's why they're approaching you with the foot in the door technique. Another technique is called door in the face. It's sort of the opposite. That's when you make a large request first, knowing it's going to be rejected, and then you follow that up with a smaller request. For example, if I was in the classroom and I came up to you and I said, hey, can I have $50? Well, you better say no. Your professor shouldn't be asking you for money. But, that's clearly an egregious request. No one's going to say yes to that. Then I'll follow that up and I say, well, can I borrow your notebook for a second? And then you give me your notebook. Aha, I got you. I got you to comply with a smaller request. Now, in this scenario, why would somebody do this? Social psychologists say that this involves a matter of reciprocity. Go ahead and write this down. That for some people who believe in fairness, well, they want to reciprocate a sense of fairness. For example, if I say no to my professor who wants $50 from me, I'm not going to give in, but I'm going to feel if he hits me up with another request that's reasonable, well, it's only fair that I make a concession, that I give him my notebook. So some people have a need for reciprocity, that it's only fair that, if I'm going to say no, I eventually have to say yes to something else, because that promotes the sense of fairness. So some techniques used to get us to comply with some kind of demand or request might be very effective if the strategy is based on one's need for reciprocity. So if you look at A and B on the slide, this is basically discussing two techniques designed to get people to comply with the request. The first one, the foot in the door, is going to appeal to the individual's need for being consistent, or their perception of being viewed by others as being consistent. Where the other one, the door in the face technique, is used based on targeting the individual's perceived need for reciprocity, that they want the other person to see them as a fair person. Likewise, we have a lowball technique. And this is something that car dealer salespersons engage in. They try to get you to comply with an attractive request. For example, you're going over the numbers and the salesperson says, okay, great. You're willing to buy this car for this much down on these terms every month for 48 months. Okay, great. And you look at this offer, it's like, wow, this is great. This is really sweet. Yeah. I'll buy the car today if you could authorize this. And that's when the salesperson says, okay, let me go check with my manager. Well, he leaves, goes in the other room, and he's not checking with his manager. He's sipping on his coffee, making jokes, whatever. And then he comes back out and he says, oh, I'm sorry. My manager says I can't make the payments $99 a month. It's going to be $140 a month. In other words, he's going to renege on the offer and follow it up with a less attractive request. Now you're looking at $99, and now you're looking at, well, maybe he doesn't say 149. Maybe he comes back and he says 119. You're like, gee, that's not what we agreed upon. And the salesperson's like, well, I know it's only $20 more, but that's really the best I could do. I've done all this for you. I've really stuck my neck out on your behalf. In other words, this lowball approach is going to appeal to your sense of consistency. Now it's $20 a month more, but this salesperson is banking on the fact that you had the perceived need of being perceived as being a consistent person. And then you think about it, well, I guess he's done all this for me. It's only $20. Okay, that means I'll have, a couple less Starbucks coffees. And okay, sure. Okay, let's buy this car today. Boom. And he wins. Or she wins. So there's another technique targeting an individual's perceived need for being consistent. And then something that you see on late night TV commercials, the "that's not all" technique to getting a person to comply with a request. And this basically involves giving somebody a really nice, attractive request. And before the person could commit to it, or before a person could respond, you follow that up immediately with even more benefits before the person gets a chance to respond. Like when you watch a TV commercial for these military binoculars that are high grade and it does all this great stuff and it's at the low cost of $19.99, but that's not all. If you order in the next 30 minutes, we will give you a second set for free. And you're like, oh my God, I have to buy this. Well, why would somebody comply with that? This type of technique appeals once again to a person's perceived need for reciprocity. If you think about it, somebody's hitting you with a great offer and then they're following it up with even more. It's only fair that I go along with it. It's only fair that I comply with this request because, oh my gosh, look at how much I'm getting. Well, that's why people are kind of foolish in buying things they don't really need because they either have a perception that they're getting an offer. Wow, this is a deal. And underneath that is a sense of reciprocity. And it's only fair that I take them up on this offer. So these are some things to consider in the area of social psychology, why we comply with requests. Now, the next concept is similar to compliance. We're talking about obedience. We're not talking about acting in accordance with a request. We're talking about following the commands of an authority figure. So you have somebody who's in charge of you and they make a demand upon you. Well, you basically have to obey with those demands. Well, why is it that we obey with demands? This is a matter of obedience. And there have been some really cool research studies and experiments on obedience. The first one I'm going to talk about is from Stanley Milgram, his famous obedience study of 1963. I'm sure that you could find some YouTube clips and some stories about this. But what I want you to know is even though that his experiment was fascinating, a lot of folks missed the point in that he was trying to demonstrate the role of the situational context. What he set out to do was to demonstrate that a situational context has a major influence on our willingness to obey. I mean, it's one thing to say something to somebody, yet it's another thing to put them in the context. So before he did his experiment, he collected some survey research. And he asked folks in the form of a survey that, hey, hypothetically, you're in an experiment, you're helping me out, and I want you to administer electricity, electric volts, to research participants. Every time they get a question wrong, you have to hit them with a volt of electricity. And you're going to have to increase the voltage all the way up to 450 volts. I mean, that's a lethal level of electricity. So when he put this in the form of the survey, not a single person said they would go to the full maximum voltage in this hypothetical scenario. I forget what the number is, but almost all of them said they were going to stop at a certain point well before the maximum level, 450 volts. So they are not in a situational context. They are taking a survey. All of them said they were not going to go to the maximum level. The vast majority of them said they would only get up to something like 250 volts or something like that. The exact number is not important. What is important is they were all adamant saying they would not go to the maximum level. Then he followed up this survey by having an in-person experiment. So if you were involved in this study, you would come in and Stanley Milgram would say, okay, great, I need you to assist me. That person over there who has set up these electrodes is going to receive an electric shock, and I want you to be the one to administer that electric shock. And to get an idea, I want you to put your fingers on this metal plate here, and I'm going to give you a very small, don't worry, it's not going to hurt you, it's a small dose of electricity. I think it was 15 volts. So boom, you get zapped with 15 volts, and you're like, whoa, I felt that. So you have an idea how much 15 volts affects your body. So Dr. Milgram is going to say, great, now this person is taking, I forget what the exercise was. I think it had to do with learning words or definitions or something. And Dr. Milgram is telling you this is a study on positive punishment. We want to understand the role of punishment to facilitate learning. So every time this person gives me an answer, I'm going to look to you to let you know whether it's right or wrong. And for every wrong answer, I want you to hit that person with a zap of electricity. Can you do it? And then you'll go along and say, oh, okay, wow, this sounds cool. So this person is given answers, and he gives this one answer, and the doctor looks at you and it kind of gives you the nod, and that means it's your cue to hit him with electricity. This person gets hit with electricity, and you see him kind of jolt a little bit. But there's a twist. For every answer that is wrong, you have to up the level by 15 volts. So you started with 15 volts and now it's 30 volts and goes up to 45. And the more voltage that you are administering, the more pain this person is going to experience. So you might have it up to 120 volts and this person is starting to sweat and shake. And this is what went on throughout his experiment. Here's the thing. That person was not the research participant. You were. That person who was getting the electricity zaps was not really getting hit with electricity. That person was an actor. He was a confederate of the experimenter. He was acting like he was getting all the voltage. There was no wires really connecting to him to the electricity. In fact, you were the participant in the study. You were the one who was administering the electricity, so you thought you were the guinea pig. You were the research participant. The point was that Milgram wanted to know to what extent would this person go on continuing giving these electric shocks at very high levels. And when you were in this situation, in the real life situation, nearly everybody went to the full 450 volt level. And that's the point behind this study. That if you're not in this situation, you're going to maybe not be so obedient to a command. You're going to feel confident and say, no, I would never do that. But when you're in that context, your inclination toward obeying is completely different. That's the point behind Milgram's obedience study, that there are major differences in responses to surveys versus being in the in-person experiment. Now, this study was replicated in a slightly different way a few years later by Hoffling and others' famous Astrotin study. Now, Astrotin is the name of a drug. Now, when a bunch of nurses were given a survey, and the survey question was, would you give a high dose, let's say 300 milligrams of Astrotin to a patient if some doctor called up your unit and commanded you to do this? Now, nurses have to follow through with doctors' orders. Doctors are the authority. And the survey question is, would you do this? Well, the vast majority of nurses said, well, no, because they know something about this drug. They know it's a fatal dose. So the majority of them in a survey, like 31 out of 32 of them said, no, I would never administer this. So to put it to the test, Hoffling and colleagues actually created an experiment within a hospital setting where they had doctors phoning the nurses in real life, commanding or ordering the nurses to give this very high and dangerous dose of this unauthorized medicine to patients. And guess what? When this happened in the real context, 21 out of 22 nurses actually obeyed. They went into the room, they're getting ready to administer a fatal dose of this drug, and that's when the researchers, I guess, came out of the closet and said, stop what you're doing, no, do not administer this. This is an experiment. And then they explained their deception. They said, this was an experiment, you know, here's the real doctor, this doctor's telling you now, don't administer it. So, again, we see another example of the situational context, that in Hoffling and other study, the vast majority of them said by survey they would never do this. But when they were put in that situation, the vast majority, 21 out of 22 of them, actually obeyed. Interesting stuff. So let's move on and talk about social facilitation. We're talking about the influence of a group having on our performance. Well, social context is a very powerful thing. Social context generally arouses individual performance. So think about making a public speech or making a presentation in your class. You know, that's kind of unnerving. There's something about standing up in front of a whole bunch of people where it's like we could feel their energy. Well, does that social context improve or harm your performance? The answer is it depends. In some instances, the social context can improve your behavior. It can improve your performance. That is when you have learned very well what your task is. So I tell students to make a best presentation, you want to know your material inside and out. You want to practice many times going over the slides. As you present a slide, you should know what's on that slide and what's going to happen on the slide after that. If you have completely memorized your presentation, if you're able to say things in many different words, if you literally say out loud and practice your presentation several times, then when you get into the social context where people are watching you, yeah, you're going to feel a little jittery. You're going to have a little more energy because you kind of feel the pressure. But that energy, that extra energy you get from the social context will actually help you deliver your presentation and help you execute it very well. That's because you've learned the task very well. Don't ever go into this context when you are not rehearsed, because when you haven't fully learned that task, you're going to choke. It's going to be horrible. You're going to make mistake after mistake. So that's why when you look at athletes, if they could perform in a clutch situation when everybody's watching, they tend to do a good job because they've done their homework, they've done their practice. So the point here is social facilitation occurs in the social context. It's definitely going to affect our performance, but we're the ones who can make the difference by showing up, being well rehearsed and well practiced. So there's social facilitation and there's also social loafing. That's when the individual exerts less effort when working in a group. Now, why would that be? Well, it seems to be human nature that if I'm in a group with maybe 6 other students, and that's what I have my students do in a lot of my classes. They have to make group presentations. They have to work on a presentation throughout the semester, and at the end of the semester, as a group, they make their presentation. There's always going to be a couple folks in there trying to slide through the cracks and loaf and try to get away with not doing any work. Why would they engage what we call a diffusion of responsibility? Well, think about it. My responsibility as an individual now is diffused. There are 6 other people in the group. So I might be inclined to slack off, to not pull my weight because, well, if I remove myself, if I don't do any work, the burden is very little to everybody else. Because now the responsibility is diffused upon the group. And knowing that, why should I be accountable? Why should I be involved? I'll get everybody else to pull my weight because I'm not asking any one person to take all of my load. I'm diffusing that. So diffusion of responsibility occurs in group settings, that an individual member of the group notices that, hey, together we all have to do a little. Where if I had to do it by myself, I would have to take on a lot. Knowing this, if I kind of duck out, well, I'm not really posing a burden on the rest of the group members. So, it's kind of uncool, but this is sort of a social dynamic that there's a tendency for some individuals in a group to engage in social loafing because they know somebody else in the group is going to pick up the slack. They know that the responsibility is diffused among many others. With that in mind, it brings us to the bystander effect. And we're talking about the probability of helping somebody in an emergency situation. So if you're walking on the street, let's say you're downtown in the Loop and it's lunchtime, everybody's on the sidewalk trying to get, their lunch or whatever. You see somebody who's in need, somebody who's in need of emergent help. There's a great probability no one's going to do anything. Well, why is that? Why is the probability less when there's so many people around available to help? It gets back to diffusion of responsibility. So if I'm minding my own business and there's like 20 people in this immediate area in the sidewalk kind of minding their own business, and there's one person, crying out for help. Well, all of us are probably going to think, why should I be bothered? Somebody else will help out. There's like 20 other people here. I'm too busy trying to get my lunch. And some social psychologists have done some research demonstrating just that when there is somebody in need, there isn't going to be a bystander willing to help out that person when there are many people around, because there's going to be a perception that somebody else will get involved. Why should I get involved? It's none of my problem. It's none of my responsibility. I should just move on. However, the probability of helping out somebody in an emergent situation is greater when there's only one person around. So you're walking in the sidewalk, it's a different time of day. There's hardly anybody on the sidewalk. Somebody tripped and they fell down. They look like they sprained their ankle. And you see one other person, they're not doing anything. Chances are you'll probably stop what you're doing, thinking, well, there's no one else helping this poor soul. I might as well see if that person's okay. Maybe ask if I could call for an ambulance or try to help. So the bystander effect. We're very likely to actually be involved as a bystander when there's very few people around, thinking no one else is going to step up if I don't step up. But the probability of our involvement is decreased when there are many people available, because the mindset, the perception we have as an individual is, well, there's so many other people who are going to help out, so I don't need to get involved. Now, something else related to groups is de-individuation. Go ahead and write this down. All right. De-individuation has nothing to do with diffusion of responsibility. De-individuation is something completely different. This occurs whenever we are in a large group setting, that there's a tendency that I lose my sense of individualism and I develop a sense of awareness and identity as a member of the group. This can be a very dangerous thing. When folks are in groups, there's a tendency for them to be aroused, get energized for that group's cause, and experience a sense of anonymity. In other words, in that moment, if I'm in this group and we're protesting over something, I am more a representative of that group than I am John Major, the individual. So if I don't have a sense of who I am, I'm experiencing a sense of de-individuation. And if I'm highly aroused, I might be likely to do something that goes against my moral code. We're talking about mob mentality. When you get a whole bunch of people together and they're really angry, where the individual members lose their sense of individualism. They become de-individuated, and they could do some very horrible things. We're talking about mobs that riot. We're talking about members of hate groups like the KKK or even terrorist groups. They lose a sense of individualism. That could be a very dangerous thing. So it increases the likelihood of one to ignore their own moral values or their moral compass. And they might be prone to act in a very aroused state without thinking about, the consequences. And that's why we want to prevent riots from occurring. You think about any riots throughout history, a lot of damage happens. People do things in that group mentality that they would never do as an individual. So groups can be very powerful at increasing a sense of de-individuation, and that can be very dangerous. Okay, another topic of interest among social psychologists are attributions. In other words, the explanations we have for our own behavior and others' behavior. Why is it that we draw these conclusions? This happened because that happened. We make this attribution of something causing something else to happen. Well, there are various types of attributions that have been studied in social psychology. The first one I'll discuss is called fundamental attribution error. So we're making an attribution erroneously. We're making a biased assumption based on two things: dispositional influences and situational influences. So go ahead and write this down. That fundamental attribution error occurs when we overestimate the internal influences and underestimate the external influences. Go ahead and write that down. Again, you could always hit pause and rewind if I'm going too fast. So, think about it. You notice somebody dropping a glass of ice water. You know, what's the attribution you're going to make? In other words, what caused this to happen? You could look at that many ways, but you'd be making a fundamental attribution error if somebody drops a glass of ice water because, well, it's slippery. The external or situational influence would speak to the condensation on the glass. Ice water, especially a warmer temperature, leads to condensation, meaning we get that watery feel of the glass. It's like, the glass is sweating the water through the pores of the glass. Maybe that's the external factor that attributes to why the person dropped the glass, but you don't give it credit. You underestimate that, and you overestimate the internal influence. In other words, you say that person was a klutz. They lack coordination. So when you underestimate one thing, the internal influence, and you overestimate the internal influence, and you underestimate the context of the situation, you are engaging in what is known as fundamental attribution error. So there are many things that go on to a behavior or something that we see, and we could be erroneous in the attributions we make for that behavior that we see. Fundamental attribution error means that we underestimate something going on in the context, like the situation, and we overestimate the personal disposition. In other words, what's going on within the individual. Likewise, there's another attribution error that we make, known as the just world hypothesis. It's this assumption that the world is a fair and just place. Therefore, the attribution we make is that folks get what they deserve. Now, this is interesting. There are people who make such attributions. They think everything is fair, when they might be likely to engage in this biased way of appraising a situation because everything is going well for them. Therefore, everything is fair for everyone else. But we know that there's a lot of inequities in the world, especially in U.S. society. And this is something we'll talk about when I get into the lecture of community psychology. But why is it, people kind of make these attributions? Well, they're operating under this biased assumption that everything is fair and people get what they deserve. Now, another type of erroneous impression we can make is known as the primacy effect. It's not the same thing that we talked about in cognitive psychology. We're talking about the first impression effect we get of somebody. So impressions of others, the first impressions they make of us, the impressions we get from our earlier experiences bias us in overlooking maybe additional information we obtain from them. Think about Donald Trump. He made a pretty good impression among his constituents when he was running as president, when he had 7 other Republicans he had to beat in the primary. People loved him. I thought the guy was, are you kidding me? He'll never be president. But he was saying things that made a deep impression among his voters. Like, we have to drain the swamp. There's so much corruption. We need an outsider. So that made sense. And I think people would agree that we needed some kind of change. But he has done so many things, said so many things since then, that his own fan base fails to see it because they're experiencing this primacy effect. The first impressions made a lasting impression on them to the point they cannot take in any additional information. So they are biased under the primacy effect. Now, you've probably heard of the self-fulfilling prophecy. And this happens, I think, in matters of horoscope. But it's really a bit more complex than that. It's this idea that you have an expectation, that expectation creates a behavior, and in turn, that behavior causes some kind of consequence. Go ahead and write this down, and then I'll explain it. So take a look at number 1. One's expectations creates behaviors. I should say one's expectations create behaviors. So I have these expectations, and that's going to create these certain behaviors. I'm going to act in accordance with my expectations. So, let's say, a student thinks I'm a jerk. Like, oh, I believe John Major is a jerk. And as a result of that expectation, they treat me like a jerk. They disrespect me. They say and they do these things. And in turn, now take a look at number 2. These expectations that cause behaviors leads another person to act in accordance with those expectations. In other words, in the example, if you believe I'm a jerk and you treat me like a jerk, you're going to act in accordance with your expectations. And then, well, I'm not going to put up with that. I'm going to put you in your place. I am basically going to respond to that. And maybe I do it in a less colorful way. That's going to be proof that I'm a jerk. You're going to have that self-fulfilling prophecy. You see, he is a jerk. He just proved himself to be a jerk to me. Well, maybe you need to take a step back and think about the fact that you treated me like a jerk because you believed I was a jerk. In other words, you've engaged in the self-fulfilling prophecy. Sometimes we kind of interact with other people in a way that's biased, in a way to get them to react to us that confirms our suspicions of them. Another attributional error has to do with what is known as the actor-observer bias. That's when we don't treat people fairly. Maybe we take a look at our own behavior and we make the attribution, my behavior has something to do with the circumstances or the situations. But when it happens to someone else, you don't extend them the same credit. You kind of make the attribution that has to do with their personal dispositions. So maybe if I drop a cup of hot coffee, I'm going to make that attribution, well, my cup was hot. But when I see somebody else drop a hot cup of coffee, I'm not going to cut them the same slack. I'm going to make the attribution that they were clumsy. It has something to do with their personal dispositions. But if a failure falls upon me, I'm going to excuse myself and say, well, it had to do with these external things. Likewise, we have self-serving bias. And it's very similar in that now we're going to make attributions of our success based on our own efforts. So when good things occur to me, I'm going to say it had to do with my hard work and my own personal disposition. But what about when it comes to my own failures? What kind of accountability am I going to demonstrate? Well, oh no, I'm not going to own up my failures. I'm not going to take any accountability. I'm going to blame that to situations. And, I'm no fan of our current president, Donald Trump, but it's very clear to me, and I think it's pretty objective to say that he engages in self-serving bias, that he really grabs any credit he can, saying it has to do with his genius because he's this great person. But when there's any failures, he chalks it up to fake news or it's out of his control. And I think the whole COVID-19 response is a prime example. He takes no ownership whatsoever to that. And he's not alone. A lot of times people have a tendency to engage in self-serving bias. But since we're talking about our president, I think he's an example of the next concept, the false consensus effect. Meaning it's a belief that we have that our behaviors and our opinions represent the rest of the world and represents what everyone else is thinking, when in fact they don't. So we make, these attributions erroneously in a false consensus sort of way, believing that our opinions and our behaviors are representative of everybody else's when they're not. And related to that is the false uniqueness effect. You guessed it, that's having this belief what I have is so novel, it's so unique, it's unlike everybody else's, when in fact it's truly common. Okay, and lastly, we have cognitive dissonance theory by Leon Festinger. We're talking about a sense of dissonance between our attitudes and beliefs and our behavior. Maybe we're doing something that is not congruent with our attitudes and our beliefs. Maybe our attitudes and beliefs are not consistent with our behavior. So we have to do something to resolve this sense of dissonance. Maybe instead of changing our behavior, we change our attitudes. For example, you have somebody who's a smoker. The smoker knows that, smoking is unhealthy, it can lead to cancer and all these other problems. You don't have to tell a smoker, hey, that's bad for you, you should quit. Well, they know that, but why do they persist in smoking? Well, it's much harder to quit the habit of smoking, and it's a bit easier to change their perspective on things. So smokers tend to change their attitudes and say, well, I'm not going to live forever, nobody else does, and no, 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 no. So how do we deal with a sense of cognitive dissonance? Passenger believe it's much easier to change the attitudes and the beliefs than it is to change the behavior. So we modify our beliefs and our attitudes to be more congruent with our actions. Okay, that's it for this lecture on social psychology, and take care.